Hello everybody and welcome back one more time to one more video about Fallout New Vegas. It is my usual final verdict video on the game, and before I get to the actual verdict part, there's two things I want to talk about first. The first one is actually just a schedule announcement for those people who haven't seen the announcement that I made on my channel page, because I'm never quite sure who actually gets these notifications. I know they show up on people's front pages usually, but it all depends on the algorithm, so a lot of you may not actually see them. So basically, I have some vacation coming up soon, 2 weeks of vacation, and I will be away for most of the time. So I won't be starting the next game right after finishing this one, as I usually do, because I feel it's rather inconvenient to start a new game and then after 2 or 3 hours I'm going to go away for 2 weeks and then I have to get back into the game once I return. So I will not begin the next game, which is Horizon Zero Dawn, by the way. If you have forgotten, I did announce that a year ago when I announced Fallout New Vegas. Instead, I will switch my other game, Assassin's Creed Origins, where I'm currently playing the final DLC, over to a daily schedule, because I hope that this way I will be able to finish that game before I go on vacation. Because again, it would be kind of stupid if I had to take a break a few episodes before the end of the game. And then I'm planning to start the next two games once I'm back from my vacation. And the next two games are going to be, as I said, Horizon Zero Dawn and Assassin's Creed Odyssey. No, I'm not going to play a short game in between Assassin's Creed the last few times, because in this case, the holidays are basically my break. I usually wanted to play a short game to take a break from Assassin's Creed for a while, but in this case, I will have my break anyway. So yeah, I will give you exact dates about when the next games are going to start once I have a clearer picture of when that will be. And as always, I will announce it on my channel page, but also on my Twitter. So if you want to make sure not to miss these updates, you should follow me on Twitter. And you usually find the link in every one of my videos in the description. Alright, now let's go and talk about the actual game. But before I want to go to the proper verdict part of this video, I want to talk a little bit about the ending, specifically the epilogue that I got after the ending. And like I mentioned in the previous episode, I actually thought it was pretty good. It was certainly better than I expected. I mean, when I picked the NCR, I said that, this is the option where I feel it's not going to be a perfect ending, but at least I'm not going to screw things up majorly. And this is pretty much what I got. Even a little bit better than what I thought it would be. And I did mention that the NCR is, in a sense, the most predictable option. And I guess it was, because it is kind of what I predicted. So I'm actually quite happy with the outcome. And in addition to that, fighting the final mission, the battle at Hoover Dam, on the NCR side actually felt surprisingly good. It felt like it was the right decision, because I was fighting with the NCR and all the allies that I gathered over the course of the game, and I was fully committed to this cause. I wasn't there for some duplicitous purposes, because I don't know how this mission plays out when you're going with Mr. House or the Yes Man. Obviously, you still have to defeat the Legion, because neither Mr. House nor the Yes Man want the Legion to take over the dam, but they also don't want the NCR to keep them. So you're either going to fight against both of them, or you will be subverting their efforts in some form, or I don't know, something has to happen that makes you turn on the NCR so that they will lose the dam eventually. And honestly, I think it wouldn't feel the same. It wouldn't be the same, feel of unity, and we're fighting together for, victory and against overwhelming forces. So, yeah, while I was playing that final mission, I was actually pretty glad that I picked the NCR option and didn't go for the yes man, which I probably would have preferred under different circumstances, but it just didn't make any sense for Hera as a character. And now that I've seen the final battle at Hoover Dam, I'm even more convinced that it would not have made any sense for her to beg anyone else but the NCR, because I guess it would have required a certain amount of scheming and duplicity or flip-flopping that I feel wouldn't be very characteristic for her. So yes, I made the right decision for Hera. She definitely had to back the NCR based on what she's been doing the entire game. So I'm certainly glad that I picked that option. However, there's two things where in hindsight I would probably change my decision if I had known the outcome, and that is Arcade's and Veronica's companion mission, because their ending feels, well, less than ideal, and I'm guessing it's because of the decisions that I made during their personal missions and the advice I gave them on what they should do. And I've been thinking about it, and I feel the mistake that I, or by extension Hera, made in both of these cases is that the advice she gave them was basically based on what she thought they would prefer and not what she thought would be better for them, which isn't necessarily the same thing, I suppose. So in case of Veronica, I didn't specifically tell her to stay with the Brotherhood, but I didn't tell her to leave them either. I went for like the middle option, where I was basically like, yeah, you have to decide this for yourself. And apparently she decided to stay, and she decided to stay with them indefinitely, so she didn't try to leave later either. Now, the reason why Hera told her to, well, not leave the Brotherhood is because while Veronica had some problems with them, she still seemed fairly attached to them, like as a family and as a home. So outright telling her to leave them behind didn't really seem what she wanted at that point. Even though Hera may have thought that leaving them would be better for Veronica in the long run, because she just didn't fit in there all that well, and Hera didn't really have a good opinion of the Brotherhood to begin with, so she probably wouldn't have a problem telling Veronica to leave them behind. But she didn't want to give them advice that, wasn't what they really wanted. So she basically just told her to, well, stay for now and maybe leave later. That was basically like the idea. And in Arcade's case, again, he seemed to be somewhat attached to his old colleagues from the Enclave, so Hera advised him to fight alongside them, because at that moment it seemed what he would prefer, but in the long run it probably would have been better for him to stay with the followers, because that's where he built his new and current life, and it would have been safer. So yeah, I feel the mistake was that I was thinking too much about what they would prefer in that moment and not what would be best for them in the long run. So that's pretty interesting. But yeah, these are two decisions I would probably change, because I feel it's not the best ending for either of them, specifically for Arcade. And Veronica seemed kind of sad staying with the Brotherhood. So yeah. These are my two regrets in regards to the ending. But with the rest, not everything is perfect, but I can live with most of the other outcomes. So yeah, that's basically what I wanted to say about my epilogue. Now let's get into the discussion of the actual game. And as always, I'm going to start with the technical aspects like the graphics and the gameplay. And well, graphics-wise, obviously the game doesn't compare to like recent titles. It is one of the older games that I played on my channel. Not the oldest, but it is roughly as old as Dragon Age Origins and Assassin's Creed 2. And I would say that in comparison to these two games, this one aged slightly less good. I mean, some parts of the graphics look pretty good. I thought the surroundings, the environment, specifically in the open world, looked pretty good. The overall design of the places was fine on the outside. I will talk a little bit about the interior design later. One part where you could definitely see the age of the game was the almost utter lack of facial animations in the characters you talk to. I'm pretty sure that Dragon Age Origins and Assassin's Creed 2 had at least some very rudimentary facial animations on characters when you spoke to them. But in this case, they really just, stared at you with empty faces. The good part is that the voice acting was generally pretty good, so all the emotional depth and emotional message could be carried over via the voice acting, because the faces didn't really do anything in that regard. But like I said, the environment, like the Mojave Desert, actually looked kind of neat. I mean, it was basically just one very homogeneous region with slight variations when you went into the mountains and so on. But they managed to do surprisingly much with it by changing the color palette a little bit. Like in some places of the Mojave, things were a little bit more reddish or bluish even, or like the greenish part down in the south, and other parts of the Mojave were more yellow. I mean, yellow definitely was the dominant color in the game, but I thought they did some pretty good work with different color palettes and so on, to make the surroundings not quite as sameish all the time. And yeah, the design of buildings was weird. I could swear that many of these buildings were significantly larger on the inside than they were on the outside. That was always kind of confusing, especially since some buildings just seemed unnecessarily large. Now, I would say for some places it kind of made sense just as a means of world building and creating a certain atmosphere, like the casinos. Okay, I can understand why they would be so big, because you wanted to convey this, feel of being in like these huge, glamorous places and so on. But some other buildings also seemed necessarily large, and there wasn't really anything going on. Like the King's building, the School of Impersonation. What was that all about? There was like a whole building, and there wasn't really anything in these buildings. I mean, some loot, but most of it wasn't really all that interesting. So that was a little bit confusing. So I'm giving like a thumbs up for the environmental design of the desert and the surroundings. I'm slightly confused with some of the overly detailed design of the buildings, which only confused you because you thought maybe there's something here, but then you just spent like 10 minutes running through an empty building and nothing was there to be found. So that was kind of weird. But all things considered, I thought the graphical design was fine. There were a lot of nice little details, like the posters on the walls and so on, and they did a lot of good work with explaining and building the world just by the visuals of the design, so that gets a thumbs up from me. And considering that the game was set in a literal wasteland, there was actually surprisingly much going on and lots to explore and discover. Like I said, I do like the design of the open world and the fact that they managed to put a decent amount of stuff in this world, even though it's basically just a desert. Just the buildings and the interior of the buildings were sometimes designed a little bit too large, I feel. But yeah, maybe let's continue with the general gameplay. So Obviously, what they've been trying to go for here is a combination of a classical RPG and, a first-person shooter, or third-person, as the case may be. As you've noticed, I mostly have been playing in third-person, but that is just a personal preference. I just like third-person better than first-person. If I can avoid it, I'm not going to play in first-person because, I don't know, it just makes me feel disembodied. So I was glad they let me switch to third-person. Of course, that also meant that you could see the somewhat clunky animations of your character, which looked a little bit weird. Maybe that's the reason why they want you to play in first person, because they didn't put that much effort into animating that. But let's talk about the gameplay. So the shooter elements of the game were, I thought, not that great. It was a little bit clunky for a real shooter. The weapons, they didn't feel like they had any weight to it, and I only knew that I hit something because I watched the health bar go down. There was no real feedback when I shot enemies. It also seems to be rather random whether you hit something or not. What I did like was the sniping, especially later in the game when I had a good sniper rifle. You may have noticed that I started to use the sniper rifle more and more towards the end of the game. And usually when I was using the sniper rifle, I was actually aiming manually, not using the VEDs, because I thought that was actually kind of fun. But for a proper shooter, the game would be a little bit too clunky, and your character felt a little bit floaty, not really connected to the ground a lot of the time, so that was always a little bit weird. But the gameplay elements that were more RPG gameplay elements were actually pretty decent. You had all these skills that you can take, including rather unusual ones like science and repair and medicine. And you had that interesting, psych evaluation test at the beginning of the game, which was a pretty neat way to introduce someone like me who had no idea how this game functions and what skills you want to take to the game, and basically decide your skill distribution based on a few questions and ink blots and whatnot. And you can change that or just retake the test, but I decided to just, accept the result of my first test. And I think the 3 skills that the game gave me as my primary skills were, at the beginning of the game, science, melee, and energy weapons. And I think science was the one with the most points. So basically, I decided to run with that. I ran with the science aspect and focused on that, and related skills like repair and medicine and speech. And I decided to go with one combat skill at first, and eventually I settled with guns and not energy weapons, which, was the one that the game gave me, because I feel that early in the game it was a lot easier to find guns and ammo for guns than it was to find energy weapons and energy cells. So at first I just continued to build up my gun skills. But for the most part, I try to focus on these, let's say, intellectual skills. And I probably wouldn't have done that if it wasn't for the test, and if the test hadn't given me so many points into science. Because usually when I play RPGs, my characters are more blunt force melee people. So going for someone who was focused on science and repair and medicine was somewhat unusual for me. And, it was an interesting and fun experience to play a character who was a little bit different in that regard anyway. So I thought that test was a pretty neat idea, and I'm glad that I decided to, go with at least one of the skills the test recommended for me, which was science, because in the end it kind of defined what Hera was as a person. So I did enjoy that. However, what I have to say about the skill system is, while you can build up a certain specialization at first, as the game progresses, I feel this specialization becomes less and less important, because at some point you have so many points, you basically just level up all of your skills. So your special skills aren't really that noteworthy anymore. So yeah, at the beginning I felt that there are some skill checks like science or speech that I can pass that other people who have focused on, I don't know, melee or lockpicking or guns or whatever couldn't take. So I have an advantage here as a science specialist. And in return, obviously, there were skill checks that I couldn't pass, like some lockpicking checks or barter, because these were skills that I didn't really invest a lot of points in early in the game. But I would say that after like 2/3 of the game, you had so many points that I could pass almost every single skill check, whether it was lockpicking or barter or whatever. So your specialization didn't really play much of a role anymore. I mean, I still tried to focus on it, and if I had the choice between different skill checks, I tried to use the ones that I felt were more fitting for her, like science or medicine or whatever. But yeah, maybe they made the skill checks a little bit too easy in the later parts of the game. I don't know, maybe it would be a good idea to have skill checks become more difficult with your level. So if you have a high level, you need to pass higher skill checks. That way your special skills actually play a larger role in what options you can take and what not. I don't know. It's just a suggestion. It just occurred to me that, while she was a scientist at the end, she was also pretty good at basically everything else. So why have these points if you can max them out almost all of them, right? But for the most part, I think the RPG elements were fine. You had these special perks where you could specialize your character even more. Some of them seemed like really, really specialized. And it's kind of hard to decide which of them are actually useful if you're playing the game for the first time. But they certainly give you a lot of options to customize your character in very specific ways. So yeah, the role-playing elements of the gameplay certainly were pretty good. The shooter elements, well, not quite as much, I would say. I wouldn't play this game if I wanted to play like a good shooter game. That's all I'm saying. Of course, there are like additional aspects to the gameplay that I can't really judge because I never really got into them. I never really tried melee, even though it was one of my higher skilled at the beginning. But I decided to go in a different direction because I usually have like, melee fighters and soldier type characters in other RPGs. So I never tried any of these special moves that I learned, or, the whole crafting and drug element of the gameplay. I mean, I did do some crafting. I crafted eventually some weapons, repair kits and stuff like that. But drugs is something that I never really used extensively, so I can't really comment on that. But I acknowledge that this part of gameplay is there and might help you to specialize your character or whatever. And finally, maybe a few words on the dialogue system, because that was a bit of a mixed bag for me. On the one hand, I thought the dialogues in this game were pretty well written. People talked like actual people. I never got the impression that the writers were trying to cut down words to meet a certain word count or whatever. You don't always see that in especially newer games, I feel. So yeah, I thought the dialogue itself was exceptionally well written. However, the dialogue system could be kind of confusing at times. Sometimes when you had more than one potential option as a reply, it wasn't obvious whether picking one of these options would progress the dialogue to like the next part of the conversation, or if you could pick the other options as well. And then you had to like go back to the beginning and pick the same options again and repeat some pieces of the conversation to go back to where you had the different options if you wanted to pick them all. And it was really easy to miss because obviously the ones that you picked were already grayed out, so you couldn't really tell if somewhere down the dialogue tree there were some options you hadn't taken yet. And it was really confusing at times. So yeah, I'm sorry if I missed any important pieces of dialogue because of that, but that certainly took a bit to get used to. Yeah, I guess that's most of what I have to say about the gameplay. Maybe one more thing about the general design of the game, specifically the maps and the quest design. I have mentioned this before, but the maps in this game were near to useless, especially when you were inside a building. It was really hard to find your way on these maps when you were specifically in a vault and the place had more than one level because the maps never showed more than one level. So trying to use the maps when inside a building was always a game of chance. And when you were in the open world, it worked a little bit better, but as soon as you had more than one quest marker, it became kind of confusing to see, okay, which part of this quest is which quest marker. You couldn't really tell. So yeah, while it was a pretty neat idea to have the map and all of that stuff be an actual part of the in-game world by having that Pip-Boy, it certainly had its, limitations because you were using like tech that looked like it was made 50 years ago, even though it's technically in the future, but that is certainly what it looked like. So yeah, when it comes to menu design and stuff like this, they certainly went for more of like immersion than what is actual practical, I feel. All right, I guess that's enough about the technical aspects and the gameplay for now. So let's talk about the story and the characters and so on. And well, I mean, as far as the story is concerned, I would say it's a pretty basic premise. Your character, mostly by chance, gets involved in these political events, and in the end they have to choose a side. That's pretty straightforward and nothing too special about it. I would say what makes the whole thing pretty original, though, is the setting. Again, post-apocalyptic setting in itself is not exactly original. As a matter of fact, I tend not to like post-apocalyptic settings all that much for that very reason. They are very often not very original. Maybe the deluge of zombie games has something to do with that as well. But Fallout definitely managed to carve out a pretty unique corner of the post-apocalyptic genre by having this kind of alternative retro future setting, which is pretty unique indeed. And more importantly, by not being all that serious, at least in this game. I'm not sure how it plays out in the other games, but this game certainly was a little bit tongue-in-cheek all the time. I mean, on the one hand, it was a serious game about serious subject matters from time to time, but there certainly also was a lot of hyperbole and a bit of satire involved, and I feel this made the game stand out from the usual post-apocalyptic games that you find in far too large numbers. And I think I also like the fact that the game was set a reasonable amount of time after the actual apocalypse and not like right after it or during it, like a lot of post-apocalyptic games, because I think that's the one part of this genre that actually interests me a little bit more. Basically how societies will rebuild and how these societies would look like after like a few hundred years. So setting this like 200 years after the apocalypse actually made it more interesting to me than the actual raw fight for survival that usually happens right after the apocalypse, but I'm more interested in the rebuilding process that occurs eventually. Also, I am really amazed by the amount of world building and lore that there is in this game. I mean, of course, they are like the two older games, Fallout 1 and 2, but even beyond that, I feel that they put a lot of effort into giving this world an actual history, and it's not just, a setting that they wrote for this one game, but there's no real depth to it. But this feels like a real living world with lots of different aspects and facets that exist independently of this very game, but that happened before or happened somewhere else. So that was really fascinating. And I would also commend them for being able to make this game accessible to someone like me who hasn't played any Fallout game before. And still, I was able to keep up more or less. Yes, I didn't understand some of the connections, but I never felt like entirely lost in this huge amount of history and backstory and lore. So I thought this is actually a pretty good way for a newcomer like me to get introduced to the franchise, because while you get a feeling for the lore, you don't get overwhelmed by it. But you know that there is this whole other world behind this game, and that was pretty well done. But either way, in the end, the game led to a fairly typical choose your faction situation where you had to pick a side. Of course, you had quite the variety of options to choose from: NCR, the Legion, Mr. House, and the Yes Men, who in a sense wasn't really a faction, but more like a potential means to a potential end that the game wasn't really very clear about, by the way. And I have already talked a little bit about this when I made my final decision. The game does seem a little bit lopsided in terms of the faction content, lopsided in favor for the NCR, because almost everything you do in this game that is related to a faction is for the NCR. There is a little bit of content for the Legion, I suppose, and there's probably more if you actually decide to side with them, but I feel it's not comparable to the stuff that you do for the NCR. Again, there's no real side content for Mr. House and none for the Yes Man. So, yeah, it feels a little bit unbalanced. And while I understand why the Yes Men didn't get any side content, because that wouldn't make any sense, and I understand to some degree why Mr. House didn't get any, because again, I guess it makes sense for him to not give you any because he doesn't really care about that kind of stuff. The question is, could they have given us more content with the Legion? Because as it stands, the Legion as a faction ended up being like really, really one-dimensional. So we never really saw much of them other than the camp, the Legion camp, when we visited Caesar, and the occasional raiding party. So all we had as a reason to side with them was that discussion with Caesar, and the discussion with Caesar basically came down to, I hate the NCR and I want to destroy them. He just disguised it in lots of important sounding words and a poor understanding of history, but in simplified words, that's basically what it came down to. So the Legion isn't really an option, it's more like an anti-option. If you really want to destroy the NCR, you go with the Legion, but not for what the Legion stands for, just to be against the NCR. So maybe this was intended by the writers to be like that, and maybe that's the reason why they didn't bother to include any real Legion content to make them seem more two-dimensional or even more appealing. Maybe they thought the Legion is beyond hope, nobody is going to side with a bunch of slavers anyway, which honestly I don't think is the case, because I'm sure a lot of people pick the Legion because it's edgy or whatever. So, I don't know, maybe they didn't want to give the Legion more content because of, the way they are. So, okay, that's fair. But I think it might have been interesting to explore more of the culture of the Legion and if there's anything to the Legion beyond, an army and a bunch of slaves. Maybe there isn't. Maybe that's why the writers didn't bother to include anything about the Legion other than, what we had. But it still means that in the end, a lot of the content in the game was for the NCR. And in the end, that was the reason why I picked the NCR, because I felt I've been doing so much stuff for them already. Why should I suddenly change now? It doesn't make any sense, right? But yeah, that is certainly something that I noticed about the game. I wouldn't necessarily say it's a bad thing, but it's certainly something that is notable, the lopsidedness of faction content. And speaking of which, I wonder if the game was being so vague about the Yes Man quest on purpose, because one of the reasons why I didn't go with the Yes Man is because I couldn't really tell where this was heading. I mean, there were the implications very, very vaguely that it would lead to Vegas independence, but it wasn't really obvious. It could just as well mean that the courier is going to rule Vegas. I mean, that was basically Benny's plan, right? When he set up the Securitrons and when he set up the Yes Men, he wanted to be the next ruler. So now that you have taken over Benny's options, it stands to reason that this was the outcome of the plan. And the game wasn't really clear about what exactly going with the Yes Men would entail. Now, this might be because I haven't really followed up on that quest a lot. I've talked to the Yes Man once when I met him for the first time, and that was pretty much it, I believe. So maybe if you actually continue to work for the Yes Man and return some of the quests for him, he will actually tell you more about the end game. So yeah, again, I'm not sure if this was intentional by the writers to leave the Yes Men so vague, because I feel knowing what exactly I'm doing here and what the outcome is important when making a decision about the end of the game. But yeah, overall I thought they presented you with some interesting and diverse options. But like I said, in hindsight, I'm happy with the one that I picked. And I feel if I wanted to pick any of the other options, I would have to play the game entirely different with a different character who has a different relationship with the NCR to begin with. And then it would make sense to pick one of the other options. All right, maybe let's talk about the companions next. So, when it comes to content and general character depth, I would say the companions in this game rank somewhere in between Skyrim followers and your typical BioWare companion. In Skyrim you can have followers, but I remember when I played that game, I never really used them because they were kind of useless other than to carry stuff for you. And I was always worried to get them killed, so I would never really take a follower with me. And in this game, at least, you can talk to them and you have missions for them. But the options to interact with them is obviously not as detailed and complex as in your typical BioWare game. And it also kind of differs a lot from companion to companion in this game, I might add. So maybe let's have a few words on every companion, maybe in order of my recruitment. I started with Edie. Not much to say about Edie. It's a robot. I liked Edie. Edie was cute, but I wish Edie would have been like the Edie from the Lonesome Road DLC, because Edie in that DLC was actually pretty awesome. So it would have been cool if the real Edie in the Mojave would have been the same. Then the first, human companion we picked up was Boone. And, well, you may have noticed that I always like to joke a little bit about Boone, because he was maybe a little bit too much of a trope. The traumatized ex-soldier with a dramatic past, always brooding and stuff. As a matter of fact, he was so much like this trope that, just like Ulysses, I sometimes wondered whether it was meant to be serious or whether they were just trying to make a parody of that trope. I honestly can't tell. I have to say that his companion mission was actually somewhat interesting, but his broodiness was a little bit too much for me. I will say one positive thing about Boone, though. Finding the right stuff to do in order to get his companion mission was fairly intuitive. He hated the Legion, he was an ex-NCR soldier, so anything related to that or killing Legionnaires was like a safe bet to get some points from him. So that wasn't too difficult compared to some other companions. Alright, so let's talk about the next companion, and I guess that would be Veronica, right? Yeah, I liked Veronica. She was fun. She was a bit more complex than Boone. To be fair, the misfit, as in the one member of a group of people who doesn't really fit into that group, is a bit of a trope in itself as well, but at least it's a more original trope. And I thought that her companion mission was actually one of the most interesting ones that we had in the game. So I would say that Veronica was one of my favorite companions. And she gave me her companion mission like really, really quickly. Like after traveling with her for, I don't know, an hour or so, she already talked to me and asked me to help her with that. So I didn't have to do much in that regard. Of course, that also meant that I didn't really took her with me all that often. But I still feel I had her in my party reasonably often compared to some other companions. So yeah, I liked her. I wish I could have taken her with me more often. I feel that the game maybe is not specifically designed to rotate your followers that often, but they mostly expect you to stick with one or two and keep them with you for most of the game, just by the way how some of the personal missions are designed. I don't know. But yeah, I'm guessing the next one was a Kate, probably. We met him at the Old Mormon Fort. Again, I liked him. He was more complex than Boone. His personal mission was, well, not as intuitive as Boone, finding the right missions for him. But I would say it's still manageable. I got a hint in his regard that I should, watch out for science-related missions. I guess you could maybe figure this out on your own, but it's certainly a bit harder to figure out than Boone, who at least was pretty straightforward about his interests and so on. And I do feel kind of bad that I maybe screwed up his ending due to my recommendation to him in his personal mission, because I'm guessing because I told him to fight with his Enclave colleagues. He got kicked out of the followers, so yeah, I blame myself for that. But yeah, who was the next companion? Probably like Rex. Again, not much to say here. I guess it was an interesting idea and interesting personal mission because you basically had to find a new brain for Rex, and I found the one brain of a dog I already killed that belonged to one of the fiends. And it seems that Rex is going to be fine, even though I gave him that violent brain. So I guess at least I didn't screw up that decision. Because again, I was a little bit worried about that when I had to make that decision. But I didn't want to kill another dog for the brain. So I took the one that already was dead. And it worked out in the end. So I'm happy about that. But yeah, having like a robot dog is a pretty neat idea, so I like Rex. Alright, let's talk about Cassidy next, maybe. And yeah, I feel really, really bad for Cassidy because judging from that very long initial conversation that I had with her, I would say she was probably one of the most interesting characters in the game. And in a sense, probably even my favorite character. But I rarely used her because she gave me her companion mission right in the beginning. And then I finished her companion mission. And then I decided, okay, I probably should keep my other companions around now, those that haven't given me their missions yet. So I put her on the bench and hardly ever used her, which is a pity because I really liked her. And I wish the game had a different mechanism to get these personal missions that doesn't require having someone in your party the entire time. Because, like I said, it just means that some of them, those who give you their mission, like up front, kind of have to take the backseat for a while. And that's sad because I really like Cassidy. So, as a small consolation, I at least took her to the final battle at Hoover Dam. But yeah, Cassidy, I like her. I wish I could have taken her with me more often. So I guess the next one is probably Raoul. Yeah, I don't really have a lot to say about Raoul. I'm glad that I managed to get his companion mission in the end, but I honestly don't see how you are supposed to find his companion mission without either getting some kind of help or just having him in your party the entire time. That was really, really vague and really hard to find. But at least I got to hear his entire life story. And I will say this, while his background story seems a little bit much of a stereotype, I think it's also giving a bit of a human aspect to the Great War, because you usually just read about it and it seems very distant. And like I said, the game is sometimes very tongue-in-cheek and not always like entirely serious. So I think it's really important to have this first-hand account to remind you that nuclear war is actually really, really terrible. Because, to be fair, it doesn't always get treated like that in this game, where, you know, exploding nuclear missiles is sometimes just a fun gameplay mechanic, or where being exposed to radiation just means that you can live for hundreds of years. So if that was the function of Raoul as a character, I think it succeeded in this function. And finally, there's Lily, obviously, and again, don't have much to say about her. I feel they included her because they felt you needed a super mutant in your company, but they didn't really do a lot with her as a character. Honestly, I didn't fully realize what her problem or her dilemma was with her grandchildren that she was about to forget until I actually got her quote-unquote companion mission, which was basically just a short conversation. And I don't even know how I got that, so that was just pure chance. So, I don't know, I feel if they wanted to give you a super mutant, they could have done more with that. Lily feels kind of half-baked as a character, so yeah, I don't know about her. Alright, I guess that's all I have to say about the companions. Maybe finally a few words on the various DLCs. I won't be talking about Lonesome Road again because I've done already extensively after I finished it. But what about the other DLC? I thought they were fine for the most part. I liked them all for various reasons. I liked Honest Hearts because it took you to, you know, a different place that looked different and that gave you the opportunity to explore a little bit what life outside of the Mojave looks like, you know, with the different tribes and so on. It also gave you a bit of backstory to the Legion, thanks to Joshua Graham. So, yeah, I really enjoyed that one. You got some new companions, at least for a short amount of time. So, that one gets a thumbs up from me overall. Then the next one I played was Old World Blues, which was significantly more over the top than the main game. I mean, yeah, the main game also is somewhat wacky at times, but Old World Blues certainly stepped it up a notch, and I really enjoyed it. Also, it was science-focused, which was perfect for my character. My only problem with the DLC is that maybe it was a little bit too large. There was like this whole map full of stuff. I mean, at least it was for the most part useful or worthwhile. But fighting through the big empty was a real chore. The the Robo-Scorpions were damn annoying, and they never stopped spawning even after you finished the main story. So yeah, that was not really enjoyable, but I did enjoy the story and the general setting of the DLC. And finally, there's Dead Money, which was interesting. It certainly had some unique gameplay functions, some of which, as I mentioned during the game, felt a little bit contrived. You know, they obviously thought about, okay, we want to have certain gameplay elements, and now we need to come up with an explanation why this is. And that's how they arrived at the premise for this DLC, I believe. But overall, I still thought it was nice to have, something different for a change. Okay, I think that's more or less everything I wanted to say. I hope I haven't forgotten anything. Maybe to summarize, I really enjoyed this. I mostly enjoyed the setting, the not 100% serious treatment of the subject matter, especially since, for the most part, they managed to balance the tonality quite well. So on the one hand, we have that serious subject of apocalypse and nuclear war, and on the other hand, the game is a little bit wacky, and I feel that this could go poorly pretty quickly with these shifting tonalities. But I think they managed to balance them pretty well for the most part. The notable exception here is also Lonesome Road. I talked about this earlier. I like the characters in the game. I wouldn't play the game just for the gameplay alone. There certainly are some unpolished edges in that regard, but I didn't hate it either. I even increased the difficulty at some point, which I usually don't do if I'm not impressed with the gameplay of a game. Then I usually just leave it at, the default standard normal difficulty. But I eventually increased it to hard. I mean, very hard for taking out Caesar and then back to hard, which is what I had for the rest of the game. All right, I like this game, so I hope you liked my Let's Play of it. And the question you probably have now, as a matter of fact, I already got this question on more than one occasion. Will I be playing other Fallout games? Yes, maybe. I honestly can't promise anything at the moment. I have already mentioned the next games are going to be Horizon Zero Dawn and Assassin's Creed Odyssey, because these have been announced for a while already. And I haven't really planned further ahead than that. But I certainly wouldn't be opposed to play another Fallout game in the future. And the most likely candidate would probably be Fallout 3. I mean, some people seem to suggest to go on to Fallout 4 directly, but honestly, if I were to play another Fallout game, it's probably Fallout 3. I don't think I'm going to go back to Fallout 1 and 2, because I'm not sure if they would fit my channel. I'm not specifically a retro game channel, so I'm not sure if this would find an audience here. But Fallout 3, sure, why not? And maybe at some point Fallout 4 as well. But like I said, at the moment I haven't really planned ahead any further than the next two games in my schedule. And I will decide what games to play after that once I actually get to the end of these games. But yeah, let's wrap it up now. I hope you had fun with this Let's Play. Thank you for joining me and Hera on this journey. Maybe you will stick around for some of my other Let's Plays, or maybe you will come back whenever I'm going to play the next Fallout game, whenever that will be. So yeah, as always, thank you for watching, and maybe see you again next time.